First, it's important to understand, if we touch on this subject, that Palestinians today are an identity of a group of people. They're very much real. They're real human beings with emotions, with feelings, with aspirations, and of pain and love and all sorts of things. So it's very important to understand that today there's a group of people who identify with this word Palestinian, and it's not up to anybody else but the individual to choose how they want to self-identify and what name they want to call themselves. But it's important to understand the history behind this word Palestine and the history and evolution that it's had over the past thousands of years, and where it's been placed today, which is very different than the origins. So the history of the word Palestine itself, it comes from a Hebrew word that is plishtim, the root word being polesh. Polesh means to invade, the plural version plishtim means invaders. And this is the word that we called an invader people that had come from Crete, from Greece, from the area of Greece today. And they were invader people called the Philistines, or the Plishtim in Hebrew. And they would invade and pillage and basically take land and take resources from different peoples. And so the Jewish people had wars and conflict with this group of people for many generations. In fact, there are many famous stories like David and Goliath. Goliath was a Plishtim, was a Philistine. Or Samson and Delilah. Delilah was a Philistine or a Plishtim. And so these were people that were a big problem to the Jewish people, but eventually we had a big war, and King David obviously took out Goliath and took out the Philistines, and they were dispersed throughout history and basically assimilated and disappeared. So we have to understand that this word Palestine originates from a biblical word, a biblical Hebrew word, or Aramaic word, you could even say, called the Plishtim. Later, you had the Roman Empire that came into power and that fought the Judean kingdom. And the Judean kingdom posed such a threat because they fought off the Roman Empire for so many years, whereas other countries either submitted to the Roman Empire or fought them off, and within a few months to a year they were taken out. But the Jewish small little country were able to fight off the Romans for so long that we kind of echoed Roman weakness to their empire, and it was very disgraceful, and we almost humiliated them, you could say. So when the Roman Empire finally conquered Jerusalem, burned Jerusalem down, burned our temple down, displaced our people, they decided, you know what, we're going to take one of your most important and vital things to who you are, your land, and we're going to give your land, the land of Israel, the land of Judea, another name, and we're going to call it Philistine or Palestine, basically naming our land by one of our former greatest enemies. Now, the association, a lot of people have to understand that live in today's day and age, it's almost as if you have country X who wants to destroy Israel and hates Israel, eventually, God forbid, does destroy Israel and renames that land Hitler, right? Because they know that would, put a knife into the hearts of the Jewish people, that they have their land named by one of their former greatest enemies. And so that's what the Roman Empire did by naming the land Palestine. It was an act of colonization. And so when the Roman Empire fell, you have different empires that rose throughout the time. You had the Byzantine, you had the Ottomans, you had lastly the British, and they always preserved the name Palestine. It didn't represent the name of a kingdom. It didn't represent the name of a country. It represented the name of a region in which they controlled amongst their vast empire, right? So the region of what is the land of Israel today, under the Byzantine, the Ottomans, under the British, was the Mandate of Palestine, or the area of Palestine. But there was never any country. There was never any society. There was never a common language, a national symbol, a national animal. There was nothing that united a Palestinian people. It was a region, and every individual that lived in that region were either called Palestinian or wanted to self-identify as something else. So if you're a Christian, you usually wanted to be known as a Christian. If you were an Arab, you usually wanted to be known as an Arab, as part of this greater Arab, pan-Arab identity. If you were a Kurd or an Armenian, you usually wanted to be referred to as that. But it's actually fun enough, it's usually the Jews who identified as Palestinian, because they didn't want to identify with other countries or other cultures, and their real culture was from this land. And if the name of this land is called Palestine, they didn't really understand the history behind why this name the land was called Palestine, but they wanted to identify with the land, so they called themselves Palestinian. So if you look at the Palestinian National Orchestra that was a Jewish orchestra. You look at the Palestine Post, that was a Jewish newspaper that eventually became the Jerusalem Post. If you look at everything that was basically written back then that referred to the name Palestine, you were often talking about Jews. And Arabs even usually rejected the term Palestine. Now, from the Roman destruction of Judea and the expulsion of Jews, again, while maintaining a small minority but constant presence of Jews in their time, you had something called colonial migration. So while you have different empires controlling this region, you have different minorities moving in, some colonizing and some just seeking economic opportunity, religious freedom. So you have a lot of Muslims that moved into the land, and a lot of Christians that moved into the land, and a lot of Armenians, and a lot of Greek Orthodox, and a lot of Druze that kind of developed simultaneously with Jews. And you have all these different identities that poured into this land that came from different regions, and that made up a region called Palestine. Now, when the British Empire finally left India and left all these places that they had colonized, including Palestine, the United Nations decided to split up the land into two, one for the Arabs and one for the Jews. Now, a lot of people make the argument that the Arabs just got Jordan, which was 3/5 of the mandate of Palestine, and now you want to take it again. But I'm not here to really debate the historical facts or the narratives, but it's important to understand where the name Palestine became relevant again post 48. So 1948, the British Mandate of Palestine becomes the land of Israel, and the portions in which the Arabs were supposed to create a state under the UN's partition plan became occupied by both Egypt, by Syria, and also by Jordan. So Jordan controlled the West Bank, Egypt controlled Gaza, and so on and so on. And you had Israel, and you had these other countries. You never had another state, you never had another country. But where does the name Palestine come back again? It was only in 1964 that it comes back, which means almost 20 years from 1948 to 1964, there's no real mention of Palestine. There is mention of destroying Judea, or Israel that it was called at the time, and there's mentions of it being part of this pan-Arab empire where, Nasser, which was the president of Egypt, would conquer this land and make it this part of this pan-Arabic dream that he had, but there's no mention of necessarily Palestine. So what happened in 1964 that it kind of made a comeback this term? Yasser Arafat, along with a lot of the leaders, created something called the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which has been responsible for many terrorist attacks, including the murder of the Olympians in Germany that played, many suicide bombings, many plane hijackings. And the reason why he chose the name Palestine, and even said it in this conference, is that if we, as the Arabs of this land, the Levantine Arabs, start calling ourselves as Palestinian, the land before the state of Israel used to be called the British Mandate of Palestine, and people wouldn't know the history that once upon a time, before it was colonized, it was actually called Judea, and it was called Palestine as an act of colonization. People won't know that history. They will only know that it used to be called Palestine before Israel, and so we are the Palestinians that came before Israel. We are the native people, and the Jews came and took away our land. And it's basically a play on words, hijacking an identity in a word that belonged to another people. But it's a little bit ironic because the very definition of Palestine, first of all, it's a Hebrew word, and second of all, it actually means invader. So they didn't really think it that through. So what you have is in 1964, the Arabs living in the Levant region, which is the region of Israel and Jordan and Syria, started to identify with this new term, where before they never saw themselves as one collective. They were one tribe in Hebron, one tribe in Shechem, one tribe over there, and they all had their different customs, even different dialects of Arabic, and different ways of life. And now they were told that they have to be seen as one group called Palestinians. Now, if this group wants to be seen as Palestinians, I have no problem with it. See yourself with what you want. The point that I have a problem with is when we try and flip and kind of restate history in order to kind of destroy Jewish identity and the Jewish connection to the land. So I have no problem with someone identifying as Palestinian, feeling at home to this land of Israel or the land of Palestine, in which they want to call it. I have no problem with them feeling connected to this land. I have a problem when they're trying to use narratives and identities in order to destroy my narrative and my identity. So that is the problem that I have with it. But I think that there's no future of this region without Palestinians, right? Palestinians will not just disappear. There's definitely no future without Jews. I think history has proven that throughout every generation. So at some point we have to figure out, what do Palestinians need now that, we understand the history of Palestine, but now there's an actual people right, that have this name called Palestine, and they have to figure out where do they move forward from here. So what do they need in order to feel no longer humiliated, no longer controlled? What do they need to feel that they succeed in their day-to-day life, have opportunities, have their form of self-determination granted to them? What do these people need in order to move forward in the future? And then what do the Jewish people need in order to move forward in the future? And do they actually clash, right? There's list of top 10 things that you need, list of top 10 things that you need, counter one another. And actually, in a lot of conversations that I have with Palestinian activists and leaders of their community, we list the top 10 things that we both need for our peoples, and they actually don't contradict. And the problem is that the entire world is trying to turn cousins, right, Palestinians and Jews against one another, Arabs and Jews against one another, when in reality we have such similar culture, similar language, similar customs, similar values, similar belief of a greater power, and we have to kind of find a way to live together and move forward and to kind of maybe even help the Middle East come out of dark ages and be a sort of enlightenment era for the Middle East, rather than continuously fighting each other and using one narrative versus the rest. And that's what I saw a lot on campus as well, that it was always, if you're pro-Palestinian, you must be anti-Israel. If you're pro-Israel, then you're probably anti-Palestinian. And it was always using one narrative or one form of nationalism against the other, rather than trying to find a way to unite the two and move forward.